Rlene Live returns to the airwaves as she rejoins the KUAM Podcast Network. She is a seasoned journalist and broadcast talk show host known for her intriguing conversation with historians, linguists, anthropologists, archaeologists, cultural practitioners, and artisans. Rlene embraces the cultural phenomena of the Western Pacific because of her Pacific Island roots with her family history in Palau, Yap, Saipan, and Tinian. She has always promoted One Micronesia, and you're invited along on this continuing discovery of what connects island people. There's never a dull moment with Rlene, a skilled ethnographer, oral historian, and documentarian. Join Rlene Live right here on the KUAM Podcast Network and on all your favorite podcast platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast, and Micronesia Publishing on YouTube. From the KUAM Podcast Network, this is Rlene Live, with conversation on island issues facing Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, the rest of Micronesia, and the Western Pacific. Now, here's Rlene.
This is Rlene Steffy, and I've had the great privilege of being invited back by KUAM to be one of their podcast hosts again. And that's a privilege that I really am grateful to have. I like the fact that they think that the material that I can contribute to the podcast team is significant enough. And of course, with my background as an ethnographer and oral historian, I have met many interesting people over the many years. One of these people is Dr. Miguel Villar. Dr. Miguel Villar most recently is a senior program officer for the National Geographic Society and the lead scientist on the Geographic Project. And that's how we met. But he also was the 29th speaker for the University of Guam's presidential lecture in 2016. And then again in 2017, this man won the Governor's Humanities Award for research and publication from the Northern Marianas Humanities Council. In 2019, he was awarded the Michael A. Little Early Career Award from the Human Biology Association for his work on human biology and genetic diversity. And you're really making a name for yourself in this corner of human interest and history. So today, Dr. Villar's fieldwork takes him into Micronesia, Melanesia, South America, Mesoamerica, and the Caribbean, where as the laboratory he studies the modern genetic diversity of human populations from Micronesia, Melanesia, Central and South America, and the Caribbean. He also researches genetics of domestic animals, which is one of the reasons why we hooked up together. Pigs, chickens, dogs, and horses, and the cultural and biological implications of animal domestication and human evolution, population, history, and migration. I actually met Miguel first through just a project with Koji Lum.
I was his doctoral student, and I think we met originally, online, given that we collaborated on a paper. You helped us collect samples for a paper that Dr. Lum and myself had a small team, and you're included in this team, where we're studying Pacific chickens. Yes. And that's sort of how we first contacted each other. And you helped us collect some samples, and then that became research on the chicken introduction to various islands in the Pacific.
I'm real tickled about that, because even though chickens are birds, I don't like photographing chickens. However, that is how we met. And it's really been a very nice friendship from that period, especially because of the more recent work that you did with the National Geographic Genome Program. I think that's when you and I not only met face to face, but have really been more in contact since then. I flew up and had the privilege of staying at Koji's house, and I interviewed him there. But with you, our interest is more shared about the people of the Mariana Islands. And as an anthropologist, and of course, you're now a PhD, you've done a lot of work on genetics with regard to the people. They want to know what their family histories are. things like that. And although we cannot pinpoint our family history that far back in the area that you're currently working in, it does inform us of a lot of the information that we don't have, that we don't know about ourselves. I'm sure your students call you Dr. Miguel or Dr. Villar, but for the general public here, you've always introduced yourself as Miguel.
That's correct. I I almost feel sort of strange when somebody calls me Dr. Villar, but in the classroom I do use that because I sort of have an authority position over, when I'm teaching and grading and correcting students. But absolutely, we've met as collaborators, and please call me Miguel. Absolutely, and all the colleagues I've met on my various trips to Guam and to the Northern Marianas, I've absolutely always introduced myself as Miguel.
I was looking through the photographs, and it was 2017 that you were last in our home, sitting here in my home office at my desk in front of my office library. And I thought, wow, 5 years, that doesn't seem that long ago.
It doesn't seem that long ago. No, you're absolutely right. And I see pictures of myself then and now, and I'm grayer, and and we all sort of have aged over the years. And these last couple of years with COVID, it's been a lot of stress and a lot of dealing with difficulties. But yeah, it doesn't feel that long. And I think between the years of 2013 and about 2019, I traveled to Guam and Saipan primarily, at least 5 or 6 times, and met you, I think, from the very first time I went there in 2013. We met a few times, and I think 2017 was the year that we went to your home and shared some together. And yeah, no, it's been always a warm welcome for me. 2019, unfortunately, was the last time I was there because it was, it's COVID-19, right? That was the year that ended that year that we started going through this shared global pandemic that we're in right now still.
I know. These are very challenging times. And I also am wearing my pandemic hairdo. I've totally gone gray. I've decided no more beauty shops and no more dye. But that's okay. I have no problem with that. I think the pandemic helped me to see that there are things that are more important. So, Miguel, everyone has sunk their teeth into your work when it comes to the genetic diversity of the people of the Mariana Islands. But I know that the end of 2020 or the middle of 2020, when we were all brought together on a Zoom conference, a lot of anthropologists, archaeologists, historians, because there's a concern over the 3 elements that determine the origin of a people. And that, of course, is archaeology, genetics, and then the linguistics. Mm-hmm. And these 3 elements, Miguel, in many cases, they contradict each other. Right. And this is one of the reasons why continued study is so important, because you can't say with some certainty that, yes, this is the way it was. For example, one of the findings that you and a lot of the others that are working on this project, you're going to be updating again because of new findings. Tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. So you're absolutely right. The 3 major venues of study for especially the questions that I ask about the first settlers in the Marianas Islands and where they came from are those questions that all fall within anthropology. It's archaeology, linguistics, I study languages, and then my field, which is the genetic anthropology, study of people's DNA. And I did it primarily by studying modern DNA. And I worked with close to 100 different people. Most of them were CHamoru primarily from Guam, although a few were from Saipan as well. And so, but what we are seeing now is a new discipline, and I say new, it's about 10 years old, called ancient DNA, where I see it almost as a merge of archaeology and genetics coming together. And so what's been happening, one paper was published in 2020 that created a sort of a slightly different narrative than the one myself and my colleagues have said about origins, based, we think, primarily on the on the modern DNA. So what's happening now, and that meeting that you talked about was sort of a preview of larger research that we're doing this year. We're hopefully going to finish it this year, 2022, on ancient DNA, a large study of ancient DNA. And is led by both archaeologists and geneticists together. And I think that's the beauty of it. And it's a very comprehensive look about Guam's history, going from some archaeological samples that we were able to extract DNA. That's the ancient DNA, extracting DNA from some archaeological samples. Some of them go back 2,000 or more years. So to the earliest, some of the earliest peoples of the Marianas, 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. And some of them are more recent. We call them closer to the Lati period. So we have sort of a nice array, a nice sort of sequence of DNA, including also the ones that worked with me in 2013 and so forth with Genographic, the modern CHamoru, yourself included. So we have sort of a nice sort of very early, a later prehistoric period, and then modern. And we can actually take that and see transitions across time. And we can make inferences about who may have been the first people, who may have come in a second wave. And I think it's going to help answer a lot of questions. And like science, it may raise more questions. This is what we do. We answer questions and we end up raising more questions. And this is what I love about science. So I think you also hinted at something that sometimes these disciplines with biology, archaeology, language, and genetics contradict each other, or maybe don't line up perfectly to answer the questions. And that has been the case for the Marianas Islands. And I think that may continue because there's always going to be people who study languages who feel very strongly about their hypotheses, and people who study archaeology that find connections with some places that some of us don't clearly see because our genetics point to a different type of story. And that's going to continue. And I think we must sort of share our knowledge with each other, respectfully. If we disagree, respectfully disagree, and have a discourse about this. So that's where we are. But this year, 2022, should bring forward this larger project that I hope will answer some questions, and ultimately will probably raise some more, like everything else. Sure.
I completely understand the bleeding of all those disciplines, and that it's not, you can't make it one as more definitive than the other, and it probably will never be able to congeal together because there's so much unknown. However, if the discourse or if the dialogue does not continue, in the sense that the studies that are being done are not updated, then the people, the layperson, or those who are not involved in the particular study are going to continue to parrot what they want, whatever their agenda is. The way I see that is dangerous for the layperson, because he understands it even less than, you're like 2 or 3 levels away from the actual study themselves. And to be honest, Miguel, no one is going to sit down and go through your study that is being done, because it's just sometimes pretty tedious to do that. Mm-hmm. I find myself, as much as I have been around it and I can just pick up, what do you mean by this? I can only imagine how they could easily attribute, my family came from the first, migration, because it's important to some people to identify that way. When you talk about migration before the Lati period and then after the Lati period into the modern history, how do you divide that? What evidence is available to identify those migrations? Is it possible to put it in a time frame?
This is Rlene Live, and we've got more coming up in just a moment.
We use different statistical methods to sort of estimate the arrival of certain lineages of people, certain branches of the human family tree, or what I'm speaking to specifically is some of my work is in mitochondrial DNA, and I've done some work on the Y chromosome DNA. And those parts of your DNA, of genetics, are inherited in a way that you can trace it to a certain point in time in the past and in a certain place in time. However, that is such a minuscule sort of part. It shows you patterns of movement, but it's not really who we are. I don't think it's something that can define a person. So basically, if somebody were to say, I'm descendant from the first people that arrived here, that's ultimately something we can't say for sure. We weren't there. We're inferring possibly a sequence of arrivals, maybe at least 2 possible arrivals, we think. But the populations have shrank to the point in different moments in history and prehistory that everybody has connections to most likely everybody has connections to the first, and most likely everybody has connections to the second. And what I showed in my study through the Genographic project was everybody has connections to the third or the fourth, which include the European, the Spanish that came. And there's even mixture coming in possibly from Mexico that we're sort of process of publishing that may have gene flow, we call it, when you have sort of movement of genes. This is major movement across the Pacific, from most likely from Acapulco, where there was ships coming through Guam, or many bypassed and many stopped in Guam and the Marianas, carrying people of Mexican ancestry. So there's probably, if you go to prehistory, there's at least a couple stages, and then historically with the Spanish colonization and domination and trade that was going on through the Western Pacific, there were other waves of migration. And what we see is just about everybody has a combination of those different moments of gene flow, different moments of DNA coming in to the population. So I think it's a false premise to say I descend from the first people and you don't, based on maybe one marker, which I study the mitochondria. So I'll tell you, we can suggest this one came early, this one came late, but that doesn't necessarily mean that some people are descended only from the first and some people are descended only from the second. That's almost impossible to say, and certainly I would argue is false. So that's sort of where the intricacies lie, and where mitochondria and Y chromosome, which are sort of these unique, very, very small markers in DNA, help us make these long prehistoric conclusions. However, they are the incorrect way to see priority or order of arrival for somebody to sort of try to identify in that way. If that's helpful, I'm trying to sort of break down those barriers as best I can.
And I can appreciate that. So if the mitochondrial DNA is too small of a marker to be able to identify, what is the correct way to identify?
That's a good question. It's not too small to identify us as a researcher to make these conclusions, but I think it's too small for people to be saying this is my history based on this less than 0.0001% of your DNA. And so ultimately there isn't, and I argue against this when in the United States and in Puerto Rico, where I was born, people try again to use the DNA results that they might get from Genographic or from Ancestry or 23andMe. They use those results to argue for maybe some kind of a grant or something based on a certain percentage of ancestry, or they'll argue their racial identity based on a certain percentage of their DNA. And that, I think that's a slippery slope to go down. And I argue people against that method because we are all the same species. We all came from Africa over 150,000 years ago. We've all evolved in sort of different ways, but we've all sort of come together and shared genes for tens of thousands of years. And so it's almost impossible to say somebody's one thing and not the other, because we all sort of have a mixture deep down inside. But ultimately, mitochondria, which I think is probably the one tool people have used to say, I came first and you came second, is an incorrect one to do it. Which I'm kind of saying that when at the same time, it's sort of my favorite molecule to study. So, so it's sort of, I try to walk that balance beam when I teach and I talk about mitochondrial DNA. It's great to study. It's not a good one to use to self-identify or ethnically identify by any means.
So how can one say, this is how I identify? Is it even important to identify genetically?
I think the latter. I don't think it is important. I think we can use it as a tool to study science. I think it will eventually help us in understanding sort of the interplay between your ancestry and medicine and health. It's going to come into play now in the 2020s. I think we're going to start seeing a lot more medical work towards overlaying with your genetic ancestry. But I don't think that should be coming from your DNA results from a company. It should be more about your own sort of identity in your community. Also your history, your family history. It should come from other things. But even that, I think, is going to vary from individual to individual. There are people, and I'm trying to talk about this without going too much down the slope of race. But some people want to talk about race, and some people rather not talk about race, and they'll employ it when they can. I urge people not to equate DNA with race, and most anthropologists would agree with me that is not the best way to do it.
So it doesn't even make sense to do it.
Yep. No, exactly. It doesn't make sense.
And the reason I say that is because we are all mixed, as you said. I mean, there is no one pure nation any longer. The migration of people everywhere has created this infusion of different nations marrying different nations that I'm not sure that there's any one people anymore that live in isolation to the point that they can say that they are a pure race. Is there?
No, I think probably not. And even if they do find groups that have been sort of completely isolated, we can sort of attribute sort of evolutionary factors to that and say, yes, they haven't mixed. The genes may have been isolated for 1,000 years, 10,000 years. And that in itself is an interesting concept. But then assigning a racial category to that is where we start sort of falling apart. Because you're absolutely right. People have been mixing for a long time. And all people have been moving across the earth for a very long time. So even trying to find an isolated group would be quite difficult to do. And it really would have in my interpretation, would have very little meaning socially and culturally. It would be interesting to something to do scientifically for the understanding of these forces of evolution, of gene flow, the movement of genes, or genetic drift, which is sort of the isolation of a group, or the movement of genes given a small group moves or a small group becomes isolated from a larger group. Those patterns are very interesting for people like me, anthropologists, to study, but they don't necessarily have any real significance, I think, when it comes to the topic of race and the topic of ethnicity, for the same reasons that you said, that we all have a history, a shared common history, and we have been mixing, especially in the last 500 years.
Now, you have said the controversial word of evolution, and I believe in creation. And so your explanation of this population, or mixed population, as I described it, I believe that in creation, all the different nations of people, all the different genetic prints, if you will, were placed in there by God. And so from the very, very beginning, Noah's sons, one of them was Asian, the other one was Caucasian, you know what I'm saying? And then the other one was African. And so that all came even at a time when there was not this global transferring of national or international marriages at the time. So I don't think that it serves anybody any purpose to identify nationally. I appreciate very much the fact that you said we could identify like who we are, where we decide to call home, and how we've lived.
Right.
Different things, right? We changed as human beings. We're not the same people all the time. We're constantly changing.
I agree, and I think that's sort of the major point here. I think that sort of trying to create these sort of barriers between us. It's ultimately not what we should be doing with this new genetic data that we're able to use. So
okay, so why is your work so important, Miguel? Why do you take so much interest in the Marianas people? What is it that attracted you to this field?
Those are all good questions. So I'm originally from Puerto Rico, and which people may know has a similar history, but it's slightly different prehistory, or significantly different prehistory to Guam and the Marianas. And I sort of I'm a student of history, and I sort of like to find patterns, and I like to find similarities and differences. And so growing up on an island and growing up in a place where, again, sort of race and ethnicity is in everybody's mind all the time in Puerto Rico because of the heavy Spanish influence, very heavy. And then more recent, the enormous U.S. influence. It's a U.S. Territory. And we all look from Puerto Rico up north to the U.S. for questions and answers. And sort of discovering Guam during my grad school years through the help of Dr. Koji Lum, we talked about earlier, was sort of was really eye-opening to me because it seemed like it was similar. And the people I was meeting one by one, I felt a connection to. And then I think I had a moment in 2013 where I was able to travel to Guam. And I had just published a paper in 2012, my first paper on CHamoru history came out in that year, 2012. So I came here and I was welcomed by the people. I came in also having been an employee of National Geographic. That always helps when people say, "Oh, you're the National Geographic expert," and then you also, Dr. Vilar, who published this paper last year. And so I felt really welcome. And the more people I met, I said, I'm not CHamoru, but I'm from Puerto Rico, and I study diversity of groups of people, and I like to sort of explore some of that work here in Guam. And I spent about a week in 2013 meeting people and enrolling people in the project. I fell in love with it in a sense. I really, the people I met were fabulous. It made me feel really comfortable. And I had some good food. I met some nice people. I got to travel around the island. That's another thing I love about working in sort of small islands. You get to go rent a car, and I can go to the northern tip and I can go to the southern tip all on the same day. And it was very neat. And a couple of years later, I was invited to give a talk. You mentioned that 2016, that was about 3 years later, or 2.5 years later. I think it was early 2016 that I came back and met some more amazing people. I got to know people at University of Guam, and they made me feel very welcome. I gave a talk at the Marianas History Conference. I did that twice, actually, once. And I believe the first one I did was 2013. I invited myself. And then when I came back in 2016, they already knew who I was. And sort of I was able to give a more recognized talk by then. But it was always sort of like people were very welcome. And people would say to me, "So why are you so interested in this small corner of the world?" And I said, several things. It's sort of the history of it, the people, and sort of this sort of shared history, this sort of that Guam and Puerto Rico have.
Are you saying that you identify with the people of Guam?
I think I do to some respect. I would never say I identify. I think it would be a disservice to call myself anything from Guam. I'm always a visitor when I go there. But I think sort of having that Spanish colonization and then having this sort of American territorial relationship with the U.S., I do feel that sort of connection, but that's sort of a dual, opposite sides of the world, but that sort of shared history between the two parts. And I feel special when I go there. And I use that sort of that knowledge, and I use that experience that I have from those two parts of the world to draw parallels in my studies. So that's why I think I connect because of sort of my experiences in a similar and yet opposite side of the world. as it is in Puerto Rico. And that's where it stops them. And again, I've always been welcome. I've always been made feel very comfortable by people, by you've always treated me so well when I visited, and my colleagues at the University of Guam always have. The people I've met in different parts of the island, especially Guam, but also in Saipan, have made me feel incredible. So
it's just the nature of being on an island. I'm not sure that we treat Miguel Villar any differently than any other visitor that comes here. But you have to admit that you either like being on an island or you don't like being on an island. And I think when we feel that someone is appreciative of that he likes being around us and likes the food we eat, or even being in a small island and find something of value to be curious about, I think that's also something we feel. And so that's why there's a reciprocation of that kind of warmth. It's not one way. It also comes from you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I think the sort of a brotherhood, in a sense, between these various parts of the world, and again, sort of I bring Puerto Rico and Guam comparison again, the siblinghood in a sense, because of the shared history. But then you have the very different prehistory, and that's where my research has focused on in grad school and even earlier, about that story of who were the first Chamorro, which is different than the story of the first Taínos in the Caribbean. So you do have sort of a, you have sort of a different prehistory, and all of a sudden you have these layers of history that are quite similar once the Spanish
almost blurred
came. Almost blurred, trying to blur. Exactly. They've tried to blur the prehistory by layers of Spanish colonization and Spanish import of other people. In the case of Puerto Rico, they brought lots of people from Africa. And in the case of Guam, people were brought over possibly from the Philippines in different moments, or other islands in the Micronesia came over. And then all of a sudden, 1898 hits, and you have the superpower called the United States of America comes in and is the dominant force across both archipelagos, or both parts of the world, island parts of the world. And then the last 125 years have been that U.S. We've been living under the U.S. flag, both Puerto Rico and Guam, but in different ways, but similarly still, I think so.
Right.
Now, more Rlene Live on the KUAM Podcast Network.
Now, let's talk about your special interest of this ancient DNA. We know that there have been digs here on Guam. We know that archaeology has done a wonderful job to inform us of periods that we would not have otherwise known had there not been construction along Tomhum. But is it only from those digs that the studies are possible? There are different people who agree or disagree to the study of ancient remains. And when we say ancient, we're talking, hundreds of years backwards, right? So is it from that that your study can be informed, or further than that?
Well, the ancient remains are a controversial topic and are going to continue to be a controversial topic for a couple of reasons. Some people consider the remains of the people or their ancestors, in a sense, sacred and they need to be preserved, need to be cared for and respected. And ancient DNA ultimately is a destructive process, because to get the DNA, you have to, you said sink your teeth. It's interesting you use the word tooth, because for many years it was teeth that people would drill to get the DNA in. And the reason that it's destructive, as opposed to you working with modern people where they're willing to give you a little saliva, spit into a tube, no problem. I mean, that's still your DNA. We did the swab, right? When in 2013, that's what we used to use. So that is still sort of, you're sort of giving a very small and very replaceable part of your saliva, but you are sort of doing that. We need that because we study biology, we study part of life. And then we can't get saliva, we can't really get blood as something replenishable from ancient remains. So ultimately you have to destroy a tiny bit of a tooth or a tiny bit of a bone to get to it. And I understand why that would be troublesome. And lots of projects have been stopped at that point because of that. And I'm full agreement with people when they say, no, I don't think this should happen to these people. When we are able to get some DNA, whether it's from a tooth or they do this other, now they're using even smaller, I'm talking grams of DNA. So very, very small amounts of bone powder from an inner ear bone called the petrous bone. When that is used, your chance of success is much, much higher. And it's been done now in a way that doesn't destroy the integrity of that bone. And then the tooth, when it was done back then, you might break off one of the roots off the bone and try to get to the center of it. So you would try to do it in utmost respect. But that was ultimately the only way we know to get to those DNA of those people. And when we get to the DNA of those people, because they were living at one point, we can actually say things in a very conclusive way. Whereas the work I was doing with modern DNA, we can try to look at what's around now in 2022 and guess at patterns from the past. Whereas with ancient DNA, we have something in the past and we can get to the biology of that person. And then sometimes we infer from things going further past, or we can compare the modern and the one from 2,000 years ago, say, and then we can infer patterns of things that happen in between those two time periods. So it allows us to do that. But I stress to everybody that it needs to be done with complete engagement with the community, complete blessing and complete approval from the community, especially the people who ultimately are the descendants from those remains. And those we strongly believe are the people living in the Marianas today. And we know that we can guess that because of the DNA from modern people that people more willingly give, but also from just doing a few people, you can see there is a connection between the ancient and the modern. And these were, in a sense, ancestors to the living Chamorros. That said, any one person that lived 2,000 years ago may have contributed an infinitesimally small amount of DNA to somebody living today. So it could be somebody's ancestor, but the amount of DNA connecting them is a fraction of 1%, most likely. So that said, it is your ancestor, and yet your connection biologically is not very strong. So then it becomes a question of your connection culturally or spiritually. And that I can't speak to as a genetic anthropologist, but I do respect it as best I can. So somebody feels they have strong spiritual connections or strong cultural connections to remains, then I think that's a moment where we can say, well, we will not work on these remains. And people began to do DNA extractions from the soil around a dig. You've been able to get DNA that leaks at the time of death or after the time of death from a skeletal remains. People feel more comfortable, fine. You can't drill into the skull or drill into the tooth, but you can extract DNA from the soil that's right next to it. So we've been able to do that, and that technology is very young, but getting better. And people may be able, sometimes people are buried with an item. We might be able to get some DNA from the item buried with that individual, clothing and other things like that. So there's other ways to do it without partially destroying a tooth or a bone.
When you talk about extracting DNA from the surrounding area, what about destruction of the immediate burial site over time?
Well, moisture actually is more damaging to preservation, I would say, the dryness, because in the moisture, what happens in moisture is you're able to have more bacteria survive and more microorganisms that break down the bone. What happens if something dies out in the field, then like I'm talking about, here in the United States where I am right now, we have deer everywhere. When a deer dies, within a few days, the vultures are there. And after that, then you get other scavengers. And then eventually you get worms and insects and you get microorganisms. So that happens very, very quickly and very, very often in a humid environment. In a dry environment, that may happen, but not as quickly. And then in a tundra or Arctic environment, it happens much, much less. And so the first ancient DNA ever done actually came from, areas in Greenland or Alaska, or I guess nobody lives in Antarctica. So it's really areas really close to the North Pole, because our preservation had to be that good. And now with the technology, especially drilling into the inside of a tooth or drilling into the inside of the petrous, is more successful to work in the tropics, because traditionally the tropics have been a very difficult place to get ancient DNA, being right there in the tropics. It's fairly amazing that we are able to get ancient DNA. That would have been unthinkable in 12 years ago, 2010, when ancient DNA was starting to become an option. People said, yeah, but you'll never get to do it in tropical islands or tropical places. And fast forward to the 2020s, we're able to do it now. And now the question has become, just because we can, should we do it? And then we have to sort of talk about the ethics of ancient DNA, which is a very exciting topic that's being discussed throughout the world right now, because the technology is there, and people are going to museums, are going to collections of archaeologists or bioarchaeologists saying, hey, can I sample DNA from all of these skeletons that you have? And I think it needs to be done in a more systematic, careful way, and again with all the proper approvals and all the proper channels addressed. So that's where the technology is now. We're able to do it in the tropics. Now we need to sort of make sure that when we do it, everybody is in agreement that it gets done, and you have the proper authority, the proper care for these ancient peoples, because they were, in a sense, people at one point in time.
Of course. I mean, they're human remains, right?
Exactly.
So with the advancement of technology, where are we going with DNA?
That's a good question. It's almost impossible to predict. I think we're moving towards what they call the genomic era, where we actually do genomes, it's the whole DNA sequence of people. I was meeting with a lab earlier this week, and when it comes to a living person whose DNA is like from saliva or blood is quite easily replenishable, we can actually sequence the whole DNA sequence, meaning billions of points of data for an individual for, now we're talking a few $100s. There's always a cost of lab. The cost is becoming sort of the restrictive factor. In ancient DNA, we have been able to do it, but it's much more costly, and it's more difficult to do. And difficulty also means it raises the cost. So I think within 5 or 10 years, we will be able to do genomic level work across ancient DNA samples. But then I also predict that we're going to have stronger ethical considerations. There'll be probably some protocols that are being worked on, but not quite in place yet. Protocols on how to deal with ancient remains in consultation with the communities that live around the site where it was found, in consultation with the curators or the maintainers in the museum, if it happens to come to the museum. Archaeologists need to be consulted, because they often can tell you much more than just the DNA alone. And it's become, thanks to ancient DNA, it's become sort of a collaborative process. But exactly where the technology will be in 5 or 10 years, it's hard to predict, other than we will be able to read full sequences. And I think for living people, we will be able to sequence somebody's DNA the moment they're born, or even before they're born, and tell them something medically, tell the parents something medically about them. We do some of that already with amniocentesis and other types of tests that the pregnant women go through. But I think that's going to become more commonplace. So in the medical field, we definitely see some advances in that direction towards genetic sequencing of people, and even doing medical care based on your DNA. So that, I think, there's more clear path in where it's going in medical genetics. Anthropological genetics, I think it's becoming more of a collaborative process. But we are, every single paper that comes out, it's a more comprehensive DNA study, and of more individuals, and more longer DNA reads. So that's where it seems like it's moving.
So with the work that you're doing, we're going to see, from an anthropological standpoint, the movement, the people, what they ate, all those how they lived, etc. And even to the point where their food sources and their animals play a big part of that, because that all shows up, right? What will this study inform other than the medical? The medical makes me excited because I married a man who was adopted as a 2-week-old infant. And he, although he's Austrian by genetics, he's never really met his natural parents, but he was adopted by back at the time, right after the war, they kind of match you with who your parents are. So a French-Canadian mother and a German father. And those are the people that raised him. Now, he identifies not as a German and not as a French-Canadian, but an American because he was raised in the United States. And then at the age of 5, moves to Hawaii. So I think that my husband is a perfect example of someone who's doesn't genetically identify with a particular nation, because even though he's Austrian, he doesn't know anything about Austria. And we took a trip there. We went and saw the place, and it was very enlightening to see how as soon as we hit that airport and he was among his people, I lost him. I couldn't find him. He looked just like the rest of them. It was so I looked around like, whoa, where's Bob? And then he's standing there and he just blended right in, Miguel. Whereas everywhere else in the world, he stands out. He's tall, he's 6'1", he stands out. But in the place where he's from, whoosh, he was invisible. That was so fascinating. It's like, where's Bob? So I don't know exactly how, from an anthropological standpoint, all this genetic study is going to help. What do you see in the future?
I think I would like to see a future where people want to embrace the science and the history of it, and less so the racial or ethnicity side of it. And because if they can do that, then I think they can, they can get a better understanding of sort of their past in the shared history that we all have, as opposed to trying to find differences between people, try to find commonalities or similarities between people. And if we can do that, then we have succeeded. I think continue to be able to answer more questions when we work with more people. When the internet now allows you to quickly download a paper or get a paper of a new data set or new population that was studied. You can get it almost before it's actually printed, when it's still online. And the fact that you're getting people able to access the internet and get access to these papers and get access to researchers by email or something that was impossible to do, 100 years ago or 50 years ago even, then I think it'll become a more educated and a more accepting peoples to this type of work. But I think there's always going to be individuals that try to use this to position themselves differently, racially, and try to get benefits over others based on DNA. And I think that it's sort of the wrong direction to take this in. So we need to educate people not to do that and try to prevent those things from taking hold. So I think the technology is going to continue to advance. We just need to keep up with the pace to set regulations and standards in a way that is done, responsibly and ethically. And that's where I think it's gonna move. But you're absolutely right. It's undeniable when your DNA test, he doesn't identify as Austrian, but the DNA test said he was Austrian. All of a sudden he's there and people look like him. It is true. I mean, there is something about DNA that codes for your physical being, and that's sort of undeniable. And that's what people see me, and I identify as, I get the thing, Puerto Rican. People see me and don't see that immediately. However, I may be able to pull out a DNA test report of myself and say, look at this 5% down here. And that's proof right there. But people really, it's that won't cut it. But the moment that I open my mouth and speak Spanish in that Puerto Rican twang, and I tell them how much I love this food, or I tell them where I grew up on this neighborhood of this town, people then sort of make a connection to you. So DNA can take you one direction, and I think it's really more about the personal connections that you make with people. That's really where I think we need to keep doing that. And so when I was able to make those personal connections with people in Guam, I think that went a long way, more than me sort of saying something about my DNA, similar or different than yours. So I hope I can do that. I hope I'm a very social person, so I hope I can keep doing that if the pandemic allows.
Absolutely. And I'm happy to hear that you prefer that people become more unified from the humanity side rather than carving out this small percentage to make them superior in one way or politically right in another, so that their resources are funneled because of that.
Right.
Because I think the damage is that they could lose out. What if they don't have that predisposition or genetic code that identifies them? Then what? They're going to change their narrative?
No, exactly. And I think that's a wrong direction to go, to change your narrative because of a DNA test. And I tell people that all the time. And there's commercials in this country where say, I thought I was this. I took a DNA test and now I'm this. So I need to go shopping for new clothes or something. I can't remember the exact commercial I saw on TV. But I said, no, that's not the purpose of a DNA test. The DNA test is just to educate yourself more. It doesn't need to be a life-changing test.
First of all, it can't be.
Right.
I can't go and put in a kill and say that I'm from Scotland. Right. I mean, that's not what makes you. And I think that's a very glib or sarcastic commercial, maybe promoting to take the test. But being a recipient of the test myself, the only one that really commented was our youngest son. When he overheard you and I in our discussion, he came in after you left here. And he said, Mom, I always did think you looked like an American Indian. And I said, what? He said, your features are not CHamoru to him as a little boy growing up, when he saw the chiseled face, if you will, to him appeared more American Indian.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I should probably send a photo. I've never been really dark. I've always had a very fair complexion. I don't know where that comes from, but I have been fair. So I'm pulling to something. And, and that's the thing about genetics that I find. I have 3 grandchildren from the same parents. And while they look similar, they're all different look. Even my older daughter's children, one of them looks a little bit like the father with the mother's skin color, but the younger daughter looks like the mother with the father's skin color. And that is what I love about genetics, is that you could have children in a family that pull toward the recessive sides rather than the dominant sides. But yet their children will pull the dominant from the recessive side. And I find that so interesting. That to me is the beauty of the intermarriages. When you can look at a person, but you can't tell what he is. I think that's beauty. When I can tell what you are, that doesn't say much or bode well for your genetics, because your parents have been marrying the same generation after generation after generation. But if you have children where you can't even tell what they are, wow, I think that's really diversity to me.
Yeah. No, I sort of agree. And then sort of there's something about DNA recombination and the way DNA mixes and gets passed on that creates this sort of diversity. And then when you get, like you said, children of parents who come from vastly different places, then you get even mixtures that maybe have never been seen before, or combinations that are unique are unique or maybe coming together. Ultimately, everybody is a new combination every single time they're born, genetically and obviously and individually and culturally and spiritually. I think so. But sometimes when you get people whose DNA has been separated geographically for thousands of years coming together, you get sort of combinations that you've never gotten before, and it could be quite amazing to see. And there's a lot of sort of beauty still hidden in sort of the mixture of peoples. And again, I'm fascinated by sort of this interplay of genetics and culture. That's why I could never be a pure geneticist. I think I'm much more an anthropologist, the study of people, understanding people. My MO, my modus operandi is genetics, yes, but I am a people person first, and that's what I study, and that's what I try to explain. I also have a degree in science writing because I take a passion in trying to explain these often complicated subjects in a way that are easy to comprehend. Yeah. So some of these papers, I said people have access to paper. In many cases, that's not breaking the barrier enough, because some of the papers are written in very complicated ways. So I encourage people to sometimes maybe summarize them or bring in people like me that can take a complicated subject and try to explain it in a more simple way. And I think that's where we're going to reach hundreds and hundreds of people with the message. Because again, if we're looking at papers that are extremely complex and talk about symbols and charts and graphs that people don't know, you lose sort of meaning there.
I don't appreciate those charts and graphs that are so intrinsic in academic papers. I don't mind the narrative, because the narrative, you can break it down. But what makes them complex is when you have a whole sentence that's a paragraph long. That's the complex part. And that's what needs to be broken down, because the thoughts are so, they're connected, but nobody writes like that in lay terminology, right? So you literally have to break it down. And that's when that kind of skill is important. But
the conversation continues now on the KUAM Podcast Network with Rlene Live.
We talked about something that I want to get back to, and that's the three identifiers of the origin of people. Mm-hmm. And that was the linguistic part. I've known and have had the privilege of working with wonderful scholars as well in the linguistic part, the archaeology and the genetics. I'm very, very blessed to have this kind of connection with people like you who make this kind of study and can articulate this the way that you do. I've been with Lori Reed, and I've worked with Donald Topping, and unfortunately with Donald Topping, I worked with him toward the end of his life. And so I didn't have a lot of time with him, but I did have the opportunity of speaking with him about the Chamorro language, because he spent a significant amount of time and interest as well with the people of Guam and the Marianas, and put together what we refer to as the Topping Dictionary, but it's really not a dictionary, it's a word list. And he had always hoped that we, the people of the Marianas, would work on a dictionary. And it's not a simple feat. And then you have people like Bellwood, and of course, Mike Carson. Mike and I are also very close, and I've always promoted his work. I mean, the list of archaeologists that I've worked with, what a privilege I've had to be able to do ethnography work with them. That's opened a whole field for me. But when it comes to putting those three together, the most recent work that Mike Carson did was about the migration through the Philippines into the Mariana Islands. I know that you're going to have a paper coming out pretty soon on that, so I don't want you to give anything away until that's vetted. But can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I could touch it a little bit without sort of going into too much detail. So there are different sort of perspectives on the peopling of the Marianas and the first settlers in the Marianas, whether the connection is stronger to northern Philippines, Luzon. Some people have suggested southern Philippines, others Like myself, I've suggested it's probably close to eastern Indonesia, the Wallacea area, or the North Moluccas. Some even people have even suggested maybe Japan to the north, or other parts of Oceania to the south and to the east. But the stronger contenders remain to be islands or regions of Southeast Asia. And so some of the arguments coming from archaeology pinpoint a little more of a connection to the Philippines, which may be based on the amount of archaeology or samples or type of pottery, ceramic, whatever the object of study is, that draws a connection, similarities between, say, the Philippines and the Marianas. But at the same time, very little or limited has been done in other islands. And that's one argument that I've always made, is that there is a connection ultimately between the Philippines and the Marianas, but I don't necessarily believe that it's sort of ancestor-descendant relationship. It's more possibly like a distant cousin or something that share a common ancestor at some point. And that said, then we may need to look at other places, especially the undersampled and the understudied places in Southeast Asia, most likely. I think there's not enough evidence to suggest Japan or anything like that, or other parts of the Pacific. But I think there is some evidence starting to come more and more from that part of the world, namely Eastern Indonesia and Wallacea, like the islands of Wallacea, the North Moluccas being the closest to the Marianas, closest to Micronesia, those islands. Little evidence is starting to come from there, and some of it in the form of archaeology, and some of it in the form of genetics. And the third one that you mentioned, archaeology, genetics, the first one, but the linguistics, is a fascinating one. It's often been used to sort of make connections between different groups, but that's sort of based in a shared ancestry type of relationship. It's similar to genetics, and it can become arbitrary. Different linguists have different ways to measure things and different stresses on syllables versus words versus grammar and so forth. So therefore, depending on the linguist, you might get a slightly different language tree. Ultimately, people agree that the Chamorro language is a Austronesian language, which connections to Southeast Asia. That would put Japan out of the question, and probably New Guinea to some degree out of the question, because those are Papuan languages and different languages in Japan. So that does support this Southeast Asia connection. And then within the Austronesian, you have a Western Malayo-Polynesian, they call it, branch, in which the Chamorro language falls. And that puts it either like a sibling or cousin relationship with some of the languages in the Philippines. And again, a sibling, possibly cousin relationship with some ancient languages from Indonesia. And so that doesn't clear it up completely in my view, but it creates a scenario that maybe those places are where archaeology and genetics focus the work. And so my work that I published in 2012, and I presented a few times in Guam in 2016, 17, and so forth, suggests that we need to be looking more in Southeast Asia, namely the islands of Eastern Indonesia, for answers. The paper, not part of my work, but a paper came out in 2021, just last year, that was the first mitochondrial study that I've seen to go to some of these islands in Eastern Indonesia. And it was run by Indonesians based in Jakarta. It was well done, comprehensive, and that showed my evidence. It showed, this is not my work, but it showed a stronger connection to the Marianas than anything that's been published from the Philippines. So again, sort of supporting the hypotheses that myself and others had 10 years ago, 2012 is when I published my paper, saying that maybe that's the place we should be looking. One of the populations they looked at in that 2021 paper was the islands of Halmahera and North Moluccas. Is one of the first mitochondrial DNA studies ever to be done from people from those islands. Again, geographically, those are the closest ones to Micronesia. And also, by looking at maritime sort of connections and island connections, it's also the closest to Palau. And name of Palau, you could island hop distantly, but go Palau to Yap to Guam in a sense. There is sort of a chain of islands, small and distant, but they are there as a connection to the Philippines, which will require a much larger ocean crossing, which environmentally and sort of geologically, I think and given the air currents and water currents, it's less likely, in my opinion, than something that could follow some kind of trench in the water, maybe some coral and some islands in that direction from kind of the North Moluccas up the chain.
Like island hopping?
Island hopping is much, and that's what we see in the Caribbean. So when I study the Caribbean, we feel pretty confident that the people in the Caribbean, one of the major movements was an island hopping movement from South America up the chain of the Lesser Antilles to Puerto Rico and to the Greater Antilles. So would a similar pattern been able to Micronesia? I think it's quite viable. We don't have much data from Palau. We don't have much data from Yap and some of the other smaller islands in between. We have some, thanks to myself and others, in the Marianas and a few other islands further west, Pohnpei and Kosrae and some other islands in Micronesia. But it's really an understudied part of the world. And likewise, Indonesia is vastly understudied. So I think with these new papers that are coming out led by Indonesians and some of the work that we're doing, I think we might see some stronger connections. But again, it's nothing to completely refute what others done. I think it should be more of a conversation. And I think there needs to be more work to be done to help answer some of those questions. And I think there will be. I think there's this new generations of people coming in to do more work in Indonesia, more work in sort of Palau and Yap, and also other parts of the Philippines. I think southern Philippines is geographically closer and possibly genetically more similar to Indonesia and to Micronesia than, say, northern Philippines. So I think that is a huge archipelago with, it would have been dozens and not hundreds of different ethnic groups. And today is millions of people that live there. So even the Philippines itself is vastly understudied. So I think we can keep putting out hypotheses for years to come. And I'm pretty excited and feel more and more confident that the more we look in Eastern Indonesia, the more answers we're going to get. So fingers crossed.
Yeah. Isn't the hypothesis that Northern Luzon was sort of like a bridge of that migration come from the fact that they are suggesting a Taiwan dispersal?
Right. So the Taiwan dispersal has been one, it's been written about for decades. And you mentioned, you suggested the great scholar Peter Bellwood. I had a forgetful moment there. He's been talking about that. I think it's a very valid hypothesis because there are some connections linguistically, sure, yes, and some less connections archaeologically. Genetically, again, I think the relationship seems to be more of a distant cousin relationship between northern Philippines and even further distant with Taiwan. So I think the theory is that is probably the closest direct line coming from mainland Asia. Right. You can imagine migrations originating in mainland Asia, China, then obviously Taiwan, and then northern Philippines be a route in from the mainland to the islands. The other one being from the peninsula of Southeast Asia through the larger Western Indonesia, namely so Sumatra, Borneo, Java, and then island hopping across. And we think that's another possibility. And why not both? It's possible that people came in both. And we think very prehistorically, the first humans to come into Southeast Asia possibly came from that region, from Southeast Asia to the larger islands, which at that moment were still connected to Southeast Asia. And there were separate migrations that came from mainland Asia through Taiwan, the Philippines. And then they may have met, they may have mixed. Some may have met and mixed before some of them headed to the islands of Micronesia. There could have been an uneven mixing. That's sort of the interesting part to me. What were these prehistoric encounters of people, possibly in the Philippines or possibly in Indonesia, or maybe even they met up in New Guinea, because New Guinea itself we have evidence of people living there 40, even 50,000 years. So that's a long time of a possible mixing of people and gene shifting and interacting of different cultures. So I think there's many ways, and sort of the hypothesis set up by Bellwood a long time ago and others was great with the evidence given at that time. But I think now we see new evidence that says that's part of the story, but it's not the complete story.
I find it interesting too in the Micronesians' history, the pre-war history where the Chamorros moved down, including my great-grandparents rather, moved their families from Guam into Yap and into Palau. And then the Chamorros that migrated to Yap, I flew to Australia and interviewed the second generation that moved from Yap to PNG, and they were the plantation representatives of the German administration. And then when time came that PNG wanted to be independent, they said, all these expats have to get out of here. They gave them the option to come back to the Marianas or to accept a citizenship in Australia. Of course, living under the crown for so many years, they stayed with Australia. And then Bob's work through the Olympic Committee, we were going down there and I said, listen, I would like to stay an extra 2 weeks, if you don't mind, after your meeting, so that I can interview these people who have Chamorro blood in them and talk about what that history was like when they were in PNG during the German administration. And so I was able to do that. And what a privilege that was. I found it interesting, Miguel, that they retained all the Chamorro words to the body parts. The head, the hands, the butt,
Interesting.
And they even knew what the outside bathroom was in Chamorro. So even though they couldn't converse with me in the Chamorro language, there were songs that they had memorized that had been passed down called Cantan Samarita, that was passed down from their parents that they sang even when they were in PNG before the war. Many of them survived the war, World War II in PNG, and then moved down to Australia. So this dispersal, I mean, people are going to constantly move. People are going to move for different reasons at different times. And so I think that's the beauty of what you're saying to me, is that I hate to see the DNA study be used to put a fingerprint on you that's going to make you different than everyone else, when there really is no difference between you and everyone else.
Right. And I think that is that harkens back to times when people were wanting to use DNA as sort of a marker to sort of exclude people. And I think it's a dangerous path to go down.
I do too.
And I love working with DNA, but I really do not want to see it sort of being used in that manner. So I talk about it, and then I try to lay caution and say reason with its use and its purpose.
Stay where you are. The conversation continues with Rlene Live when we come back. From broadcast sales to marketing and public relations, from newspaper columnist to talk show host. Sound challenging enough for you? Not for Rlene Live, who was president of an advertising and marketing agency, then a newspaper managing editor, broadcast talk show host, and investigative reporter. All that in just 20 years. Now she's back as an ethnographer, oral historian, documentarian, birder, and podcast host on KUAM's Podcast Network. Tune in and learn the history of Itautautano, the people of the Mariana Islands and Micronesia. She's personal, she's local, straight up, and so much more. She's Rlene Live, now on the KUAM Podcast Network and your favorite podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music and Google Podcast, and Micronesia Publishing on YouTube.
Now, let me ask a question that has come up. From a historical standpoint, when the Spanish were here under the Jesuit rule, if you will, they reduced the people from the Northern Mariana Islands to Guam to control them, right? And at that period, there was a small contingency of individuals, Chamorros, who suffered from leprosy that remained in Saipan. And we know from historical records that the governor was very concerned about the resources that were for them, for their livelihood. When the Carolinians lost their atolls over, some typhoon that wiped everybody out, there were the two migrations that came. One came through Guam, the other one straight up to Saipan. The first migration that came to Guam, when they got the paperwork or the approval from the governor here that they could go up and reside, they were told that at some point the Chamorro is going to come back to their home. This is their home. But the reason I'm bringing this up to you is when you have these genetic, these human remains that are found along the shoreline in Guam or in Saipan, are they all the same or do they distinguish differently in the DNA studies?
There are some differences for sure. And I think you see, so I've seen some of the data, and I think this is the larger paper that's going to come out later this year that shows some lineages or some patterns that are different between some of the samples in Saipan and some of the samples in Guam. And there are also some differences between some very ancient some specimens that go back 2,000 years or more, and some of the more recent ones that are from what they call the Lati period, or the more recent period right before contact with the European and the Spanish colonists in the 1500s. So you're gonna see some variation, and as a geneticist, I need to be sort of do my homework and read the archaeology. But now I'm realizing more and more to read the history. So you just accounted all these historical things that happened in the last few hundred years, movements up and down the Western Micronesia, Palau, Yap, but also all the way to PNG and back, and typhoons that push people or move people to relocate. So we have to do our due diligence and study those things. I spent 2019, my last time in Guam, I spent part of my time at the Micronesia Area Research Center doing research on boats, Spanish boats that were coming over from Mexico, we believe, and bringing people over. I wanted to find out who the people were, how many were coming, because those things actually could impact the genes of those that are already in residence, especially if you have very few people and you have a large boat come over with hundreds of people. There could be some mixture that now, fast forward to 2020, is marked in people's DNA from those mixtures. So we need to sort of understand the history as well as the archaeology and the linguistics, and you can't take any one of them alone at face value. But I can't say too much about what's coming out in the papers, but it is a fairly comprehensive look, and we continue to sort of do outreach and communication with the people in these islands, especially Guam and Saipan, about the work to make sure that the people are on board. And I know you were part of that talk that we gave last year, and I believe there'll be more to come.
I had many questions. So there are two papers coming out. One that's going to be out maybe April, and the other one is later, more comprehensive.
I'm working. No, the one coming out in April should be fairly comprehensive, but looking mostly at the ancient DNA that we talked about. And then I myself, I'm working on a paper, and I've been working for many years based on some of the National Geographic genographic data and looking at the more historical period. So some of the last things we're talking about having to do with history and Spanish influence and so forth will be part of a second paper, hopefully coming out, and that's what I'm focusing some of my efforts on. I'm part of both papers, but I'm leading the second one.
Okay. So going back real quickly, and before, because I think we're probably at the end of our discussion here, but the reason that I bring up the Carolinian migration is that I don't think you can do a study in the Mariana Islands without that inclusion from the historical standpoint, because what you said earlier punctuates it for me. I mean, it only makes sense that a migration that island hops is more convenient than one that goes against the current, right? So I would venture to think that over the expanse of the populating or peopling of the Mariana Islands, that a trading or a connection with the people that are down in the Western Micronesia occurred. It's impossible to think that we were not connecting or trading with people from Yap or from people with Palau or from Pohnpei. From a linguistic standpoint, I believe we're closer to the Yapese from the Austronesian speaking people than we are to the Palauans. But there's no doubt that there's been a continuation of trading or maybe even intermarriages, that have occurred before the Spanish came here.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it would be too simplistic to think that people would settle the Marianas and then not have any connection with any other islands for thousands of years. However, the mitochondrial DNA remains different between the Marianas and Yap, between the Marianas and some of the other atolls, and very different between the Marianas and PNG, and even Palau. So they must have been moving, and possibly there were some intermarriages, maybe not enough to sort of change the genetic composition, but ultimately islanders survive often by trading and moving around in the networks they set up across thousands or hundreds of miles of ocean sometimes. So I think I've talked to Dr. Ross Hunter Anderson about this as well. She's a strong believer of these sort of interconnections, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Right. The languages were probably close enough that you could understand each other, and people by that time, by 2000 or even more recent 1,000 years, there was still no connection to Europe or anything, but people had vessels that were good enough and had the technology to navigate ocean distances quite well. So I think it would be foolish to think that there was not any sort of connection. But that doesn't take away, I think, from the fact that the mitochondrial DNA, especially of the Chamorro people, is different. So there was some mixing, but they seem to have maintained a unique signature that you don't see in Palau.
Something special about Chamorro people.
Absolutely. And then that gives us a chance to find, again, you're not going to find the identical same ones, but you might find cousin lineages or relative or related lineages in other places. And I think we still need to do a much better job at that.
Okay, so we talked about the recap since 2012. We talked about the genographic project. We talked about new technologies, about the papers that are coming out, and I hope that I'm going to be able to get it as soon as everybody makes it public. The continuity versus replacement.
Well, that's what we're talking about now. So
yes.
the ancient DNA paper that's coming out does suggest some continuity between at least the earliest settlers and now. However, you pointed out that these are islands susceptible to typhoons. I know Guam and the Northern Marianas have recently seen typhoons in the last 5 or 10 years, enough to do some major damage, and it would have done probably even more damage in prehistoric times. So there is some population replacement that must have happened. However, I think Guam is, if I'm mistaken, the largest island in Micronesia, probably the one which has the most resources. So it's possible that we see the least amount of replacement in an island that's more self-sustainable than, say, the smaller islands. So that, I think, is going to become a question moving forward, whether there is a continuity that goes back to the first settlers, or whether you see replacement. And if you don't see replacement in Guam, why is that? Does it have to do with the fact that it's a larger, more resourceful island than, say, Rota, Saipan, and Tinian, and certainly more so than the atolls of the outer islands of Yap and so forth that are much smaller and less resourceful? So those questions, I think, are going to come into play soon.
Right. And that's a very good point that you make, because based on everything that I've learned from Ross Hunter Anderson and Darlene Moore, was that when they were populated, these movements continued, but then at some point the beaches showed up, and at some point made it easy for them to, because the island was rising, it made it easy for them to come on island, if you will. But there's no way that the atolls that were down in the Chuki, Satawal, all those areas, they hadn't even been formed yet at the time that the Chamorro people were already here. So you cannot create a narrative and pull it out of the air. It has to be substantiated by facts, and facts lead us to know that when these people were traveling, exploring, they were marking all these different islands and the passages so that ships wouldn't get all stuck and things like that. And I really appreciate that part of it. So it's really important that the history be included as one of the four to be able to identify the origin of a particular people?
I think history, and I think you're also hinting at these sort of more environmental and geological patterns,
Yes.
right? We need to be consulting with paleo-environmentalists that can tell us about the rise and fall of islands and sort of the history of an island, a high island like Guam versus a atoll, like you said, in the Satawal and Chuk and others like that.
Right. That didn't even exist. How can you
Right.
claim to be there first if you weren't even your homeland wasn't there? So
Exactly.
I've brought this up to the attention of some historians, and I said, when you speak to a Carolinian, how do they identify? They identify as Rafaloish. They don't ever say I'm Chamorro.
Right.
When you speak to a Chamorro and you ask him how he identify, he doesn't say Rafaloish. He doesn't say Caucasian. He says Chamorro.
Right.
So by their own identification, forget their DNA, forget anything else. By their own identification, they say who they are. And I think that that's important to put into that mix when you're doing it. And it's not a right or wrong. It's just how they identify.
Correct. Yeah. Absolutely.
So, okay. So the summary, what does all this work tell us about the Micronesian region, more specifically the Marianas, that we have not yet said?
I think we've covered a lot. I think, like I said, more is going to come out this year. I'm excited to be a part of that. I'm excited to get a chance to travel again, hopefully this year, 2022, whether it's the summer or the fall, to the Marianas and sort of share some of this information. I think we are going to see maybe greater collaborations come out. I'm trying to talk to some other groups working in Indonesia to see if we can see more information and more collaborations there. So I think that is going to come out. But as far as the summary of where we are, I think these hypotheses will continue to exist. And I think the discussion is going to grow. And I hope to stimulate excitement even within the Chamorro community. I'd like to go visit again and meet students at UOG and even high school students to tell them about this work and get them interested. Like I said, I identify very closely with lots of the people I met in Chamorro, but I'm from the other side of the globe. I'm from the US and Puerto Rico. And it would be good to see more interest in anthropology come from Chamorro who want to grow and study this. And if that's something that interests students, I would be more than happy to share my email and share my network and resources with them. Because I think it's neat for me to study and identify. It's even better for somebody who this is sort of the history of their own people that they, again, talking about identity, they identify with as well. So I'm hoping to see that develop. We'll get some undergraduate students, become graduate students, become professors on the same material coming from Guam and the Marianas.
Why don't you share, for the listening audience, share your email address in case anybody who spends the entire time that we've been speaking to each other here really dig their teeth into this. What is your email address that they can reach you?
Well, so my name is Miguel Villar. My email address is Miguel Villar 14. So it's my name, those 11 letters together, MiguelVilar 14 @gmail.com. That's actually the one I check the most, and it shows up on my cell phone. Okay. And that's the easiest way to get a hold of me.
So what is the 14? What's reference to the 14? Is that when you got your PhD?
When I was 2010. I was saying, no, I was much older than 14 years old when I got my PhD.
I meant 2014.
I know. I was like, I'm not a super genius. But anyway, that would have been pretty neat. Thank you.
What is the reference to the 14?
14. That's one of my favorite number, but also, again, so I'm a people person. I like to meet people. It's the only number I know that you flip it upside down and it says, hi, right? HI, right?
You're corny.
That's what I tell people, and they like that answer.
That's a good one.
And also, I think when I tried it first, 1 was taken, 2 was taken. And I was like, I'm not just going to randomly pick a number. I want to pick the number. So I used Miguel Villar and 14.
Got it.
But there's no other rhyme or reason. It's just
you weren't going to go up the escalate until they got an approval.
Exactly. I'm going to pick the number myself. Hey, that worked. And I've always told people it's my favorite number. So there you go. You learned something about me there.
There you go. Well, I'm always curious. I'm the why kid, you know. My mom says that the first thing out of my mouth, why? Why are we doing this? Well, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be with you. And I look forward to both papers and updates on Zoom so that we can continue to host you on our podcast show.
Thank you so much, Rlene. It's been a pleasure for me as well. And yeah, we'll be in touch, and please share with your audience this and I guess in my email. And I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Yeah, you're gonna be the first guest in March, and Mes CHamoru.
Well, thank you.
Okay, have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Rlene Live on the KUAM Podcast Network. Join her next podcast for an all-new edition. You can catch Rlene live anytime at any of your favorite podcast platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, and Google Podcast, and at Micronesia Publishing on YouTube. We welcome your feedback and suggestions. Email Rlene at rlenelive.com. Thanks for listening.